You've heard the conventional view. Now prepare yourself to hear the other side. High school teachers Mike Margison and Justin Spears bring you the alternative view you didn't get in the classroom. Now here they are, Margison and Spears.
Remember the 5th of November. Good Monday evening out there to everybody. You are listening to The Other Side. I am one half of The Other Side, Justin Spears, and joined with me, as always, is Mr. Mike Margison. Mike, what is up this evening, man?
Not a whole lot. I was just kind of reflecting on the show a little bit as we're starting to wind it down. I know you're going to say a couple of words about that, but actually, I was pretty impressed with what we were able to pull off here. Knowing nothing about podcasting whatsoever, putting it together, and not only did we get on traditional radio, but we were on an internet radio station. We want to thank both of those for putting us on. But I had read somewhere, I can't remember, I either read or I heard that the average lifespan for a podcast, an upstart podcast, was 7 episodes. And so after 7 episodes, you would either like run out of material, or you would lose interest, or it's more difficult than it seems. I think when we listen to podcasts, actually it seems like easy. You go on there and you just talk about things, but as we found out, it actually is more difficult. But we got up with the bonus episodes close to 70. I mean, 10 times above what that average is. So I'd have to say this was pretty successful little venture that we did.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you that didn't tune in last week or are unfamiliar with what we're talking about here, we made the announcement that we're going to put the show on hiatus. We're not saying, never say never. We're not saying it's going away forever. But when Mike and I started on this endeavor, coming up on a year and a half ago now, we set out to kind of cover these topics of government and history and economics from a more libertarian perspective. And the podcasting market certainly is very crowded today. It's something that is, low barrier of entry to get into. It is difficult, though, as you were referring to kind of pull it off and make it work. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I think, I'd heard that same kind of statistic before, where the average, podcast doesn't last more than 10 episodes. And so, yeah, we found that it is a lot of work. It's very rewarding, though. It gives us an opportunity to help spread the message. We've connected with people through social media that we probably otherwise would have never connected with. And so the reason why that we're doing this isn't necessarily because, as you mentioned, maybe that we've run out of content or it's too time consuming, but we've chosen to kind of focus our attention a little bit more in another direction. One of the things that Mike and I, being educators, have done is critically reflect on the state of education. And if you've listened to the show for a while now, you've heard that, peppered in along with current events topics, historical reflections on events and people and things of that nature. And so, we just, as we have, gotten to know each other more, spent more time together as professionals, we just come to the conclusion that we can no longer just sit back and kind of gripe or complain or armchair quarterback about, the state of education in America today. We wanted to try to express this a little bit more and maybe give people who we know that we've come into contact with, whether it be, parents, students, other, coworkers, or just people in the community, a sense as to what our thoughts are on the state of public education. And so what we've decided to do is take a 2-part approach to doing that. And Mike is going to write a part of the book related to the history, kind of the background of public education. And I'm going to be focusing on the results, and I'm going to be looking at data and statistics and just kind of the overall product outcome of what our American education experience gives us today. But it's not just going to be a complaint fest. We're also then going to conclude with some solutions as what we see moving forward. So that's what we're going to be focusing our attention on. And we wanted to use the last couple of episodes that we have here to kind of give you a sneak peek behind the curtain as to what you might get if you were to pick up the book and and go through it. And so before we jump into that, I do want to just again say a thank you to Dave Peach, 92.1 1550 out of Crawfordsville, for them putting the show on Saturday mornings. I know it's reached an audience out there. I've had a little bit of feedback from some people that have heard the show out there in that region. So we thank you for that. And we thank the Cerberus Radio Network for their efforts in promoting our shows. Suzanne Sherman, Jeff Johnson, Dan Bailey, and the gang over there. We really appreciate the support that they've given us. And again, we've reached out to them and told them that we would still be available to help out with shows and give input and things of that nature. And then if you are still looking to access the archives, is not going away. And in fact, this show, if you want to listen to this, there's a number of different ways you can get that via the Spreaker radio app. And that then seeds to iTunes and Google Play podcasts. Just search The Other Side with Margison and Spears. You'll have to search that whole phrase to be able to find the show. And of course, our YouTube channel has all of the archived shows as well. So tons of content out there. That's the other thing, Mike, that this does. We've created a digital library of resources that we can use. We can steer people toward if they're interested in hearing our perspective on things. And so that's something that's always going to be there as well. And who knows, after the book is written, maybe we bring the podcast back focused around the book, and we hope to be able to generate some buzz and excitement about that. So let's go ahead with all that out of the way then and talk about the topic for this evening's show. As we said, we want to break these last two shows up into giving you a little bit of background on what you might read if you pick up the book. And so Mike's going to start us off by giving us an overview of history of education in America. So again, Mike, parents, even educators, community members, they may not be totally aware of the concept of compulsory schooling in America. Talk us through a little bit and give us some of maybe like the condensed version and main points as to what you're really going to focus on as you start to dive in and research and write your part of the book.
Yeah, sure. When you say that people may not be aware of it, I think it's one of those things that, like early on in my career, I didn't give a single thought to the institution of public education, like at all. It was like, it was just there. It's like breathing, or air. You don't think about it. You just do it. And that's just kind of the way I think the school system is for most people. It's just an ingrained part of life, and there's no need to ever critically analyze it because there is no substitution, right, in people's minds. Just like there's no substitution for air. Why would you question it? And so that has taken some time for me to be able to come around to that. But let me start with our thesis for the listeners. I want to start with the end first. And our thesis is that the current system of schooling in this country is unsatisfactory and should be abolished, not reformed. Reform isn't appropriate. Abolished. The system is flawed, and you don't reform a flawed system. You kill it. And if the objective is in fact to educate, then this system fails big time. And as you kind of stated, Justin, you're going to be talking more about the results next week. So I'm not going to go too much into that. But I do want to talk about the history of public education in this country and its origins, because if you know the history, then the results won't surprise you quite as much. And if you knew that the aim of schooling wasn't so much to educate kids, then you might be more willing, I think, to support its abolition. So when we talk about the origins of public education here, there isn't one. There are many. It's complex and it's complicated, but it is interesting. And in order to begin, we're going to have to go back about 500 years to Germany, to the days of Martin Luther, but not for very long. So we're going to head back to the Reformation. And during the Reformation, Martin Luther had repeatedly called for the state to create public schools and to make attendance compulsory. Now, his motives, of course, were for every single German to adopt his religious way of thinking, and he didn't trust the public to make the, I'm using quotes here, to make the correct choices themselves. There were Jews, Catholics, non-believers, and even other Christian Protestant sects And Luther, he wasn't, if you know anything about him, he wasn't exactly in favor of freedom of religion. So he wanted to use the power of the state to coerce people to learn what he wanted them to learn. And in fact, when I said he wasn't a lover of freedom of religion, he called for some of the most extreme punishments for those who rejected Lutheranism, including death by fire for heretics. And this may seem irrelevant, but it's actually extremely important. Germany has a rich history here of using government-controlled education to get kids to think and act a certain way. And Germany would end up serving as the model for our government education system when we adopted it in the 1800s. And, you know, next door to Germany, you saw similar things with John Calvin. He was another reformer who set up a number of public schools around the same time. He advocated, just as Luther did, for the state to force kids into schools to learn what Calvin thought that they should learn. And Calvin himself, he was extremely influential among the Puritans in the early New England colonies here. And that's where our national public school system would eventually get its start, specifically Massachusetts. All right, so the table is kind of set here, and we're going to fast forward a little bit to the early 1800s, and we're going to stay in Germany, specifically 1806. And Germany, at this point, it's called Prussia. It's known as Prussia. And the Prussian army was about to square up against Napoleon and his army. And by all accounts, this should have been a fairly easy victory for the Prussians. They were a professional army going up against Napoleon's amateurs, but it didn't quite go that way. There were, three separate German commanders in the army. And while one of them was nominally in charge of the other two, each one actually felt empowered to do whatever they wanted, and they did. In fact, in one episode in Jena, Germany, there was one German command in fast retreat from Napoleon's army. They were under heavy siege. And then at the exact same time, a second command arrived and literally began charging on the offensive. So you can try and imagine this. There are columns of retreating German soldiers, and running directly in between those columns going into the fire is a second German command. It was a chaotic, disorganized mess. And again, you might say, okay, what's the point? This seems irrelevant. Well, no, it's quite relevant. See, the German hierarchy was ticked after this. They were humiliated in this battle, which they should have won. They ended up losing the larger war against Napoleon in the War of the Fourth Coalition, and they were forced to cede large amounts of land and money to the French. So they embark on this massive overhaul of virtually every aspect of German society: economic, political, social. And this is a movement in history known as the Prussian reform movements of 1807. And key among these reforms was education reform. So what do you do when you have commanders acting and thinking for themselves out on the battlefield? Well, that dysfunction within the military ended up probably getting an unfair amount of blame. But the idea from the higher ups in Germany was, we need to inculcate this population. We need them all thinking the same way. We need to teach them obedience to the state first and foremost. Basically, we need to roboticize the population. And what better way to do that than a mandatory national school system? Get the kids early. Don't let anyone opt out. And then mold them to your liking. Now, Germany had already had precedent here. Remember, Martin Luther a couple of centuries earlier. So let me read you some quotes from Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who's one of the key educational reformers in Prussia at the time. And just in case you think I'm, grasping at straws or promoting some wacko conspiracy theory here, Fichte says, "Now someone might say, what more should one expect of any education than that it should point out what is right to the pupil and exhort him earnestly to it? Whether he wishes to follow such exhortations is his own affair, and if he does not, his own fault. He has free will, which no education can take from him. Then, in order to define more clearly the new education which I propose, I should reply that that very recognition of and reliance upon free will in the pupil is the first mistake of the old system." Now, this is not unambiguous. The objective is very clear. Compliance. That's what they want. No free will. The opposite of free will is compliance. Okay, if that one wasn't clear enough for you, Fitch would also later say, the schools must fashion the person and fashion him in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will. And lastly, most chilling to me, here is famed psychologist Russell Bertrand quoting Johann Gottlieb Fichte in his book, The Scientific Outlook. The social psychologist of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. Now, if that doesn't send something down your spine, I don't quite know what will. So again, okay, what's the point of this, Martin? Like, why should we care? Well, like I said earlier, when Horace Mann, who is considered the father of the American public school system, toured the outside world to find a model after which he'd create our own public school system, where do you think he went? He went to Prussia. Our school system is modeled directly after the Prussian model of compliance. Now, think about how schools are structured. We've got bells, we've got hallways, we've got kids walking in order, you've got desks that are in rows. We put a premium on behavior. When do kids get punished? When they act out, when they're too loud. This is about a model of compliance and obedience. And in Prussia, education was not left to towns or villages or families or certainly individuals. It was a matter of national policy. Prussia was a dictatorship. And where the dictator decides who's going to teach. The dictator decides what they're going to teach. And most importantly, the dictator makes attendance in these schools mandatory. And that is the exact system that Horace Mann preferred. Mann was appointed as the secretary of the Board of Education in Massachusetts in 1837. He was the first. Actually, I think Massachusetts was the only state to have such a board. And he had been turned on to the Prussian model by a guy named Charles Brooks. Charles Brooks, I believe, was in the Massachusetts state legislature. And so Mann went to Europe for a year to tour and see firsthand how different nations approached education. And the ones without a national school system, like England, he felt were inferior, and he wrote about this. The Prussian model, the government-directed school system, he felt was superior, and he came back and he promoted it. And here were his two biggest takeaways from that trip. Number one, you had to have a system of schools to teach the teachers. Right? And he implemented that. They became known as normal schools here. And secondly, attendance had to be mandatory, and he implemented that as well. So the government would teach the teachers how and what to teach, and the kids would be forced to attend the schools. Here's where things got kind of interesting. Mann lobbied the governor of Massachusetts, Edward Everett, who was a really well-respected politician at the time. But he lobbied the governor of Massachusetts to have the Prussian model of obedience adopted here in the United States. And so Everett the next year created the Massachusetts State Board of Education, and he appointed Mann as its secretary. And something interesting about Edward Everett, he was the first American to receive a PhD from Prussia. So after Massachusetts was successful in importing the Prussian model here, states around New England began importing Massachusetts education into their states, and soon this Prussian model of obedience to the government had spread to every state in the Union. It wouldn't be too long before that had happened. And lastly, there was also a religious element to the creation of government schools that I want to talk about. One of the things that really rubbed not only Horace Mann, but other New England Protestants the wrong way was the massive immigrants coming into the country at the time, especially Catholic immigrants. The Protestants found these Irish immigrants to be basically subhuman. And what better way to instill the proper values in these savages than with a good non-Catholic education? And I'm not being hyperbolic here. Here's a quote from one editor who writes that, quote, a Romanist minority trained by nuns and priests furnishes the majority of our criminals in this country. And here is the Massachusetts state legislator reflecting on how, quote, those now pouring in upon us in masses of thousands upon thousands are wholly another kind of moral and intellect. And I don't think he meant that in a positive way. So with over 1 million Catholics immigrating to the United States in the preceding decades, New England started seeing an increase in Catholic schools naturally. And this was unacceptable, of course, learning false religions. So there was a push to bring education under public control, and they were to be non-denominational. I'm using quotes here, non-denominational schools, but that was nonsense. In the ones that Mann promoted, they used the King James Bible and, repeated Protestant hymns and such. So,
but Mike, this surely this isn't true, because I've been told that this type of rhetoric only exists today, that this is the only time that this type of rhetoric and language has ever been used. But here you are proposing that this type of thing was happening back in the 1800s.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
And look, here's the point of all of this. Ask anyone why the public school system was created in this country, or just, read about Horace Mann in your history textbook, and you're going to get a nice, clean, tidy answer about education for all and what a noble and necessary public good it is. But you won't hear anything about the actual history or the actual motives behind the movement. And now we have these laws on the books that mandate that kids attend schools. The government makes them free by subsidizing them with tax dollars to make their schools the most attractive alternative. And they've effectively created a monopoly on education. 90% of K through 12 pupils get a government education. And I need to stop calling it public. I've done that a couple of times. It's not a public education. It's a government education at a government school. That is what our arrangement is. We have an arrangement of government buildings where kids are sent about starting around the age of 5. And if you don't have a ride, the government will send a big bus to come and pick you up. They'll bring you to the schools. They'll teach you. You're under their jurisdiction during that time, and then the bus will bring you home, and they keep you there until you're 18. And remember, this was a system imported from Germany with the stated objective of dumbing down and controlling the population. It's a chilling and frightening history, but it's one that I think absolutely needs to be told. And as far as history, I'm going to stop there, but there will be more in the book. If we fast forward further and get into the 1900s, the most influential philosopher in education at that time was John Dewey, who was basically a communist. He traveled to Russia after the revolution. He spoke glowingly of Russia. They spoke glowingly of him and his ideas and his books, and they had them all translated into Russian. And there's just this long history that's really rotten to the core when it comes to government education in this country. And I'm looking forward to telling the story, Justin.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I appreciate that kind of overview. I think I know that's not something, listen, I went through a transition to teaching program and eventually ended up with my master's degree in secondary education, and I can tell you that that's not the presentation of the public school model or anything of that nature. It's very defensive. It's very much geared toward just it is, it always is, it always was, it always will be. There's no really even need to question the roots, in learning about the school system. And as you were kind of retelling that, I'm thinking of it not only as an educator, but also as a parent. And the one thing that kind of came to my mind, especially when you said something there about, the rides with the buses, think about all of the different ways that kind of, indoctrination occurs and the way that it becomes normalized. Do you see, without giving away too much here, real quickly, when you are researching and looking at this, historic kind of timeline of evolution of education in America, is that a theme that you saw kind of develop, or what have you seen related to kind of like we don't don't even question these things anymore. You know, these things are just taken as normalcy. Some of the different things that go on inside of schools.
Well, it appears to me that it was a process because there was some pushback, and Americans early on during Mann's time. Now, remember, he was appointed to the State Board of Education in 1837. So the country was like 50 years old total. You know, it wasn't that old, and he had to tread lightly when he was talking about a Prussian model because it was a dictatorship, and people here didn't want that. So he wasn't quite as forceful, I think, right off the bat as he could have been or maybe wanted to be, because I think he anticipated he probably would have gotten some pushback. But I think it was by like the 1850s, he had compulsory attendance laws. Soon after that, he had the normal schools that were teaching the teachers. And there was just kind of this progression after that, and it snowballed into what we have today. So I don't know. I know that's not a definitive answer to your question, but it was a decades long process. There's not one thing that I can point to where it happened and you saw like, okay, here is the definitive just inculcation of our young people. But you know, the thing that bugs me most is, what are they talking about now? They're talking about expanding the ages, right? Like 5 to 18 is not enough. What do they want? They want free childcare, government childcare. Are you kidding me? Like this 5 years old isn't young enough for you. And not only that, they don't want to stop it at 18. What are they promoting on the left? Government pays for your tuition, right? It's the government is going to have you from 2 or whatever, 6 weeks till you're 23. I mean, if they keep going this way. And if you know the history behind it, you know that this makes you want to stop and say, absolutely not, because this is modeled after something nefarious, like something that was definitively evil in my mind. That's what the Germans were doing at the time.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because we both came across an article here in the state of Indiana. There was a survey that was conducted of some rural and urban communities, counties in the state, along with a couple of other states in the union. And they were looking at that exact thing. And they try to make this economic tie to how much productivity is being lost in the workplace because parents are having childcare issues. And so what was the solution? Well, as you accurately pointed out there, this study's solution essentially was, well, the government needs to provide more through tax dollars to childcare and get these kids enrolled in, 3-4 years old into these government camps before they then enter into more government camps. And I kind of reflected, and I know you wrote about the economic side of it. I reflected on it from the perspective of, listen, why, and this goes perfectly to this motto of what you're talking about here. When and why has it become acceptable for the parent to cede their power as a parent? The pressure of, 2 household workers, and you can't dare talk about somebody being a homemaker or stay-at-home parent anymore. Specifically, males can't dare mention that about females, because then you're sexist. And if you mention being the father and wanting to stay home, then somebody's like, well, are you weak? What's wrong with you? Or you're not the breadwinner in the family? Why aren't you out working, slaving away 40, 50, 60 hours a week? Well, maybe it's because I actually want to parent my children, and I want to be there as the primary source in their life to teach them the things that I think are going to be vitally important to them as they mature in this world, and not turn it over to some stranger that I have no idea where they come from. Yeah, they got this little thing hanging on the wall that says they're certified. I don't care about that. That means nothing to me. I want to be the person, and I have that right and freedom and that choice to do that. So don't dare come at me and try to tell me that I need to turn my kid over at an earlier age so that I can go out and be a more productive citizen in this country so that you can get more of my tax dollars. That's what this all boils down to. And I was red hot.
And more of your kid's brain. I mean, that's what they want. They want his soul.
Yeah, absolutely. The more that you can get them in there, and listen, we've documented before in the past here, both of us having two boys, especially my older son, he has struggled. He's in fifth grade now, but he struggled early in elementary school learning how to play the game of school. He is every year, the teachers have asked us if we've had him tested for ADHD because he doesn't play the game of school well. He doesn't sit crisscross applesauce. He doesn't sit in this tiny little desk crammed in for 6 hours a day, doing repetitive, mind-numbing work all day. He's an active kinesthetic learner, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to take my son to a doctor and get him, doped up on medicine.
Yeah, drug him because he's acting like a boy.
Right. Yeah. So that my job can be easier as an educator. So yeah, I mean, we're kind of getting off here a little bit, but I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit. That is a good segue into what I'll be kind of talking about a little bit next week with the results of this. As you just so eloquently laid out there, and really those quotes that you gave, Mike, you're absolutely right. If that doesn't grab you and just wake you up as to what is going on here, I don't know what will. But I think when we go back and look at the results of what this is going to give us, we're going to not be shocked by it, but it's something that bears showing. And I think it bears to be repeated. I know others have made attempts to do the same thing as well. So we're definitely going to talk about that from different perspectives. And again, I appreciate you going through the history of this.
Well, yeah, no problem. I think what it's going to do is it's going to make the results, when you tell us about the results next week, it's going to make it like all the more clear. Because what do we do in this country? We get these results that show that American education is slipping, or our test scores are at 37th in science or whatever. Okay, and then everybody sits around and they're scratching their heads, figuring like, how is the richest country in the world, how is this happening? Well, it's not a head scratcher to me, because the system was not designed to promote intelligence and critical thinking and actual intellectual progress. It wasn't designed for that. It never was. The history of the system was designed for compliance. And you know what? We punish bad behavior. That's what we do. When you misbehave, when you're disobedient, you get punished. And when you're not, you're rewarded. And that's what we have. We have a fairly compliant school kids.
Yeah, and let me just say this real quickly too, as we start to wrap up here, as we come up on the eve of midterm elections, it's going to make absolutely zero impact, 0.0 impact on who gets elected in these midterms. I am so tired of hearing, if we could just get the right people in office, we can get this thing turned around. These are the same people that gripe and complain and moan about politicians making decisions about what goes on in the classroom. Yet these are the same people that are out there cheerleading, go out and vote, make your voice heard. For what? So that somebody with a different initial next to their name can sit in office and do the same thing. And 2 years down the road, you're going to be complaining about people who are making policies. That goes exactly to the point that you just made there. It's the system that is flawed. It does not matter what person you plug into the office. So long as those dollars are tied to the federal and state governments, we're going to continue to get, as you said at the outset, this is a flawed system. You don't fix a flawed system. You tear it apart and you start over. So yes, this is going to seem very radical to some people. It's the same thing like when you talk about abolishing systems of governments. People, well, who's going to build the hospitals? Who's going to build the roads? As if we abolished government out of education, all of a sudden people would stop learning. That's absolutely nonsensical. It's ridiculous.
Or their curiosity would just all of a sudden go away. Like there is this natural curiosity to learn that starts at birth. like nobody would educate themselves if the government wasn't there to do it.
Right. Absolutely. So I think that's an important point to point out as well. So yeah, I'll hit the results up next week, and then certainly we're gonna push notifications out and let people know where we're at with the progress of the book, timeline, where you can get it, all that stuff. I would like to throw one last comment in here, Mike, and then I'll flip it over to you if you have anything before we wrap up here. I would almost say that we're gonna be writing this book, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, on behalf of and inspired by John Taylor Gatto, who just recently passed away. If you're not familiar with John Taylor Gatto, I would highly encourage you, if this is of any interest at all to you, or even if it isn't, if you're somebody who's, empty nester now, doesn't matter. If you have a vested interest in education, go out and look at Gatto stuff. He's got a fantastic library online. He's got several books that you can purchase. He was a New York State Teacher of the Year. Was he a two-time Teacher of the Year?
He was the New York City Public Schools Teacher of the Year, and then the State Teacher
of the Year as well. Who basically woke up. He had like a moment of clarity, and he basically looked around and said, "What am I doing here? What are we doing here?" And his stuff is just so cutting. I mean, I wish, Mike, that I could be as eloquent as he was and as cutting as he was. Just phenomenal stuff. But he's definitely been a big source of inspiration for myself as I've kind of come around on this as well. And I know he has been for you as well. So I just wanted to throw that out there too, that if you're not familiar, John Taylor Gatto, go check out his stuff.
No, absolutely. He was the first person that convinced me to actually question the system. I had never even thought to question the system until I saw a YouTube video of his once. And from then, everything has started to make sense.
Yeah. So, well, thank you guys for being with us again this evening. And as always, I know we've got some listeners that tune in to us every week, and we really appreciate that. Again, we appreciate all the support that we have gotten online, sharing of our episodes and the few comments that we've gotten. We really appreciate that. Again, we hope that you continue to stick with us and stay in touch with us. We'll finish up our shows next week with the results in education. But until then, you have now heard The Other Side.
Thanks for listening. And remember, you're not fully informed until you've heard The Other Side.